We are back again. United West and Sharia Crime Stoppers couldn't be prouder to bring you a news analysis program like none other. And we have Christine Douglas with us tonight. Good evening, Christine.
Great to be back, Dick. Thank you.
If you notice, the world is changing rapidly every minute of every day, whether it's the stock market changing dramatically or the virus expanding dramatically. And so we think that for much of the rest of this year, we're going to be emphasizing news analysis programs like this one, Christine. And we want to say that you and Claire Lopez have really set a high mark for bringing people information of a news analysis type that is meaningful. I mean, there are strategic things you talk about, things related to long-term doctrines and other kind of things, but people really are so conscious of the day-to-day changes that we really appreciate the news analysis.
It's amazing how fast, though, Dick, the world is changing. And a lot of people are busy. What they do is they read headlines, and the headlines aren't always that honest. And I'm being kind. So it's a really good thing that you have started this whole program, your organization, Make America Think Again, because things are happening fast.
Well, I think the word think is interesting. I don't think the word think should be considered a bad thing. I'm going to joke. There are people who want groupthink, who really don't want people who have gone through an indoctrination for years and years of the public school system to really think again. So we are actually encouraging people to use the brain cells. Our audience does that anyway. I'm not suggesting that they have an issue, but we're trying to provide information, maybe with a little different slant than you're going to get in the mainstream, things to get you to think about it, as well as action items. So we're very, very grateful for that. We do very much appreciate the North American view that you have to bring us. You bring us news from America, from around the world. I know you wrote about Malaysia and other places in Iran this week, but you also give us the Canadian insight. And frankly, we think the Canadian perspective is so important. I think a lot of other folks maybe forget about Canada. That's why we see some humor. Sometimes people talk about things and they'll say, meanwhile in Canada, as if one wonders what really goes on there. I think there's all kind of silly memes about tons and tons of snow and
igloos.
Challenges. Pardon me?
And igloos.
Oh yeah, igloos, all of that, people ice fishing. We have northern border states that are very similar to Canada, but a lot of the United States really doesn't come to grips with what might be happening in Canada. I think the other observation is a lot of Americans, Christine, forget that Canada, because of the British Commonwealth, et cetera, has a view of things that happen in India and Malaysia and other parts of the what might have been once the British Empire. You guys talk about it, and you've got remnants of those types of people in the country, and they still maintain their close connections, including the unusual connection to Iran that we've talked about in the past. So I'm going to invite you to get started with your news analysis of the day, and then we'll come back for some commentary and of course, questions. Again, the audience is invited to absolutely submit your questions as Christine goes through her news analysis, and we'll pick up the questions at the end with Mary. Okay?
I really appreciate you're there, Dick. And I'm glad that Dick mentioned the issue of Canada not being paid attention to. This has been going on forever, where Canada is often seen as, that's just that country to the north, that deep, cold country, and nobody watches. But in this world of globalism today, that's one of the biggest dangers. If a person is not paying attention closely, things could be going on that we should be paying attention to, and it's easy to hide because, unfortunately, Canada is not often paid attention to. And Dick did allude to something with Iran, and that's very important because years ago, back in 2012, the Iranian embassy in Ottawa was shut down precisely because there was a plan going on there that Canadians, Iranian Canadians that were loyalists to the regime were being told to basically invade Canada by a fifth column. And once that's done, there were plans in place to try to attack the United States. And that sounds like a far-fetched plan, but it certainly led to the shutting down of the embassy in Ottawa because, if nothing else, they had very nefarious plans, and we do see Iran globally and the kinds of plans that they execute globally. So before I go on with this news brief, many of you know me by now, those who have been tuning in regularly, but I'm a daily writer for Jihad Watch. I'm an editor, one of the associate editors for Front Page magazine. I've written extensively in the past. I've been on the board of governors for the fine Gatestone Institute as well. I'm an author of The Challenge of Modernizing Islam that's published by Encounter Books in New York City. And my second book, Fired by the Government of Canada for Criticizing Islam, Multicultural Canada, a Weak Link in the Battle Against Islamization. That's my second book, published by the Center for Security Policy. And it tells my story of being fired by the Trudeau government for some of the writings I did for Jihad Watch and a speech that I made specifically warning about certainly not all Muslims, but stealth jihadists. That's another topic that I hope to get into one of these days a little bit more about that book and about what's really going on up there. But I'm going to get started on the briefing that we have for you today, because there are quite a few items that need to be paid attention to. I'm going to start with a terrorist attack, and I wonder how many of you even know this, that took place in Toronto. Now, that was on February 21st, where a man by the name of Saad Akhtar, he's 30 years old, he decided out of the blue to just go out and beat an innocent 65-year-old lady to death with a hammer. This was a completely random attack. And at first it was just dubbed in the media as a murder. He gave himself into police, but it came out quite quickly, even a day later, a few days later, that it was upgraded to a terrorist attack. Now, this fellow, his mother reports, he would walk back and forth from his mosque to the house daily. And that particular Friday, when he attacked this poor lady that was just taking her walk, he didn't return home. So she kind of wondered why. Now, which is really interesting. It's really interesting here because we don't know much about the story. We don't know much about what motivated the upgrade, and that to me is very disturbing, because they must have found some kind of an evidence. You don't just one day say this is a murder and the next day come out and say this was, quote, murder terrorist activity, which is what took place. We only know that the RCMP, which stands for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and the Toronto Police said that it appears, and that's a key word here, to be an isolated incident, and there's no further known threat to the public associated with this particular fellow. But that's of little comfort knowing, well, they're missing pieces. So the big question marks is what should lead to people being a little bit concerned. A little bit unnerving also in that that came out of that particular report is that the media generally tends to underreport the threat of jihad. And in this particular story, there was something different about it, because the Globe News report that came out, this is what it included. Quote, the so-called Islamic State has since 2014 been urging followers to conduct attacks using readily available weapons such as knives and vehicles. The Canadian Security Intelligence Service, known as CSIS for short, the annual report said extremists inspired by ISIS and by Al-Qaeda were the #1 national security threat to public safety in this country, #1. And investigating these threats remains, quote, a top priority for CSIS. What's really interesting there is that CSIS comes right out and says that's the #1 priority, whereas there are other forces in Canada saying the biggest problem in Canada is white nationalism, white supremacy. No, it remains jihad, and that remains the biggest threat in every country. It's both stealth jihad and violent jihad as well. More troubling when you look at the policies of our current Prime Minister, Trudeau. He has an open door policy on immigration, gave a big open welcome to Islamic State jihadists, saying they could be a powerful voice for de-radicalization, when we know from history, from reports, that de-radicalization just doesn't work. First of all, you have to know that you're a radical and you have to want to change. These jihadists believe they're doing it for the sake of their God, Allah. That's what they believe, and they are instructed to do so, and they're indoctrinated so deeply, and many of them have committed such heinous acts that this so-called de-radicalization, particularly when you're referring to ISIS fighters, who we know what they've been doing, come on. How could a prime minister come out and think that they could be a powerful voice for de-radicalization? And he puts terrorists on par with law-abiding Canadians in his mind, and he said it. A Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian. No, jihadists are at war with disbelieving nations, that does not put them on par with every Canadian citizen. They're not remotely the same. And here's another problem, and this is food for thought, that putting them in jail with other people that are infidels is also very dangerous. UK, for example, prison radicalization there is completely out of control, where now the situation is that unbelieving prisoners are being forced to convert. So you have forced conversions going on in those prisons. It is terrible. They have even these Sharia brigades going on in those prisons. So radicalization is just out of control there. So given that attack, that's something to think about, and the reasons around it and what the threats actually are, because a little background, CSIS has also said in the past that the threat is much worse than the Canadian government often wants to admit. Something else going on in Canada, and this is a bit different than the Sharia, but what it does than Sharia expansion, because this, after all, is Sharia Crime Stoppers. But I'm mentioning it because it does give you a glimpse of the kind of lack of leadership, I was going to say leadership, lack of leadership that we have here going on in Canada. We have a big problem going on in Canada right now, and you may or may not have heard about it, where the Canadian pipeline and railway Indigenous protests have crippled a lot of the railways in Canada. And it doesn't help, by the way, that the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination called on Canada to immediately stop the construction of the Coastal GasLink and Trans Mountain pipeline. So that is the center of the problems. At the end of January, and this was around January 20th or so, protesters were disrupting the ferry service in British Columbia. But the RCMP announced that they would stand down while the Native heredity chiefs, and this is from the Wet'suwet'en tribe, where they were meeting with the province, and the police just says, okay, we'll stand down and wait to see how those go. Well, of course, sadly, it all escalated. Talks broke down. By February 4th, the chiefs and the BC government were completely at odds, and the RCMP began doing arrests. Some 21 protesters were arrested at that time. Now, protests and disruptions continued all the way across the country, so this escalated really fast. So by February 6th, protests had reached Ontario, and that's a town called Belleville, Ontario, where members of the Mohawk Nation decided to stand in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en tribes, and they started to blockade the Canadian National Railway line. And the distance, just to give you a little bit of a feel for what's going on here, the distance from BC to Ontario is roughly about 1,800 miles. So that's quite a stretch we're seeing there. And the importance, again, is that we're seeing a real big problem with the leadership in Canada. And this is what the Canadian Chamber of Commerce said. We're calling on all levels of government and law enforcement to work together to bring an immediate end to the blockades and to restore the rail service. Olin Corporation is a Missouri, and that's in the States, based chemical maker that serves some 50 companies in Canada, and they're worried that they're not going to be receiving their shipments of chlorine because CN Rail operates right across Canada, across the US and New Mexico when it comes to delivering goods. Wood, pulp, paper producers have lost tens of millions of dollars so far. Massive amounts of pulp is actually shipped into the United States using CN Rail. For passenger, Via Rail works very closely with Amtrak because both accept actually each other's transfers. So right now we have a bad problem going on, major layoffs, major catastrophe when it comes to the economy. And the big question circulating was, well, where was the Prime Minister when all this was going on? He was away in Africa. Doing what, you might ask? He was out lobbying for a seat on the UN Security Council. That has been his goal for some time. So while everything was basically, economically speaking, and protests were going on out of control across the country, fire was being lit to some of the railway lines, this guy was there in Africa trying to shore up support for his UN Security Council seat. And this is getting really bad press for him across the board, not just so-called right-wing versus left-wing kind of media that you're seeing, oh, the left-wing media supporting him, the right-wing isn't, even though there's not much right-wing left in Canada. We're seeing everybody on his back saying, wait a minute here, The anger, according to stats, is not against the chiefs. It's not against the unresolved land disputes that goes on between the Native community and the government. The problem is, what is Trudeau doing away, and what is he doing about it to try to come back and try to settle the problem? Instead, what did he do when he finally came back from Africa? This is all he could come up with by saying, we know that centuries of marginalization, of oppressive, broken government policies have created a situation that is untenable. He pretends to care about the natives, he pretends to care about oppression, but he's absent, and there's really nothing going on right now in terms of how he's trying to resolve this, just strictly talking points. It needs to be remembered as well, too, that in early December, Trudeau went ahead and betrayed Israel. Why? He broke with Canada's tradition at the UN. Instead, he ended up voting for a pro-Palestinian UN resolution that condemned Israel as an occupying power, despite his ongoing reassurances to the Jewish community and reassurance that, look, Canada backs Israel. This is what he did. And the resolution that he signed on to also accused Israel of not just being an occupying power, but of impeding the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. Finally, out of the National Post, and this is the most recent news because we're not hearing a whole lot about what's going on. I do know about the layoffs. I do know also that a family member went shopping at a major grocery chain and saw a sign up apologizing that the item that was advertised for sale isn't even in the grocery store because of these blockades. They weren't able to be delivered. So this is what came up after quite a silence as to what's really going on. This is what came out of the National Post within the last couple of days. Oh, look, it's reality. Warren Buffett just pulled Berkshire Hathaway's $4 billion stake from a $9 billion Quebec LNG project. LNG is liquefied natural gas. He pulled it out of the project because of, quote, political uncertainty in Canada, AKA, the article says, lawless blockades and a regulatory process that's all maize and no cheese. Suddenly, our larky manhandling of public policy has real consequences. We lose money, energy, jobs, and hope, unquote. But in addition to that, keeping those dots connected, we also have a big problem in Canada when it comes to security issues that I've mentioned before, given this open door policy, given that Canada has never stopped, in fact, to say, well, look, we're rethinking this so-called UN Migration Pact, which has gone silent for now, especially with coronavirus in the air. Nobody knows what's happening now. There's a lot of silence when it comes to open borders these days, but Canada promised to lead the charge. So that takes us to another story. And this story is not old, and I intended to talk about it, but I had to, the Sharia Crime Stoppers gang, they're so kind. I had to delay by a week and switch places with Claire because I was battling a cold. And this is what I wanted to discuss with you guys, because I think it's very important, especially in an era of political correctness and identity politics. In India, so-called racist Trump was given the royal welcome, while, let's not forget, in 2018, Canada's blackface Trudeau was given the royal snub in India. The routine attacks on Trump is that Trump is, in fact, by the far left, by Islamophobia pushers, is that he's a bigot, he's a racist, on and on and on. He's Islamophobic, and this, sadly to say, what it ends up accomplishing, if you want to put it, if you want to call it that, is that it ends up an us versus them narrative, where it is, let's be blunt, white people versus visible minorities. Now, meanwhile, we have a person here in Canada, the leader, stoking that, all the while talking about racism, 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 how we have to stamp it out, speaking against white supremacists and so forth. Meantime, he's been caught in blackface at least 4 times. And when he was asked the question, well, how many times did you do this historically? He couldn't give an answer because there's clearly more out there. Okay, so 2 points I made in the article with Jihad Watch this week is that if Trump is a racist, why was he so well received at the largest Hispanic church in America And why was he treated like a star when he arrived in India? Let's give people of color some credit here. If they saw him as a white supremacist, they wouldn't be welcoming him with open arms like this. And let's face it, the Hispanic community has been made out by the major press agencies as being anti-Trump, while he's being made out to be anti-Hispanic, anti-Mexican. Why? Because he's trying to guard the borders. It is the legal thing to do, and there are people crashing through the borders, and he's being called racist to do so. So let's fast forward this. In early January, Trump launched his 2020 campaign's Evangelicals for Trump Coalition, and he did it at King Jesus International Ministry, a 100,000 square foot church, a mega church that's in Miami. That holds at any given time about 7,000 people, but weekly, that church sees some 15 to 20,000 people. When he spoke at that church openly and given a big welcome, laying on of hands for a long time, lots of prayer going in for this guy while he bowed his head and he was prayed for in this large Hispanic church, he spoke openly to that church about terrorism. He spoke about jihad terror. He spoke about the strike against Qasem Soleimani in Iran. And this doesn't sound like a Trump that's the enemy of Hispanics, the way he's made out to be. But for those maybe who want to bust through America's borders illegally, and the drug pushers and the narco-terrorists and the ones that insist on using women and children as human shields, shoving them out front, maybe for those types. But I know many Hispanics in the States, in Florida, by the way, and I've heard them with my own ears say, look, we are supporters of Trump. We worked hard in this country as Hispanics. We worked hard, and we're not for the bashing through the borders and the illegal activity. We don't want America to be that way where we came from. This is what I've been hearing. Yeah, there are going to be those that are going to try to say he's racist, but let's not forget how he was received in that largest Hispanic church in America. So going now for India, looking at India, Trump was greeted like royalty with pomp and ceremony the minute he exited the plane with Melania. Now we have a very short video just to show you, just to get a feel of how he was treated in India in case you might have missed it. So let's take a look there.
Welcome, Mr. and Mrs. Trump.
From the moment he landed, Donald Trump was being smothered with Indian hospitality. A bear hug from his host. A barrage of folk music.
And so welcoming.
And for a president who loves rallies, a very big one. If not quite the 10 million people he'd claimed he'd been promised.
There you see it. Now, in the words of Politico, that's generally left-leaning, the title that they presented in their paper, India rolls out the mega carpet for Trump, unquote. Trump also addressed, by the way, jihad terror when he went to that crowded stadium. And jihad terror is a topic well known to India, given its history of oppression with jihadists. And it was discussed by Trump also. He said that Canada, he talked specifically to that group. And I want to get into later on about how, because this is not to be forgotten here, because I'm going to put the Canadian angle into this about how our Canadian leader was received in India. But I want to go on a little bit about Trump and what he talked about while he was in India. He made it clear, he said, while our country will always welcome newcomers, and this is true, he's a welcomer of newcomers who share, and this is key, our values and love our people, our borders will always be closed to terrorists and terrorism and to any form of extremism. And that is for the good of everyone. It doesn't matter about color or creed. It's for the good of everybody inside the American borders. He says that's why we've taken the historic steps to improve screening and vetting of applications for entry. And that is a real hot spot there, because people who are watching what's going on with immigration and they're being responsible, they're made out to be anti-immigrant, period. And that's simply a big, fat lie. It's not that people are generally anti-immigrant. It's obvious given the history of Western countries. Western countries have been extremely welcoming, but there comes a point where you have to start guarding your borders when you come face to face with those who have absolutely no regard for your people and no regard for your borders. And that does not mean exclusively any given group, but there is a problem with jihad terror in the world. Just look at the Middle East, look at what's going on in Africa, and it should be obvious. Look at the groups that we see and the Muslim Brotherhood organizations throughout the West, it is a problem that we face. It is a big problem, and it takes diligence to stand up and say enough and protect the security of one's nation. And this is precisely what Trump is trying to do. And he talked about being welcoming, opening the doors to those who share the values. These countries of concern, by the way, these Muslim countries of concern for this temporary ban were all decided by the Obama administration, by the way, but we don't hear a whole lot about that because it is to be concerned about. So food for thought for a moment. Let's think about this. He was welcomed with open arms in the Hispanic church, the biggest in the country, and look at how he was welcomed in India. Now, I wrote about Trudeau's regrettable visit to India in 2018 on Jihad Watch. The article was titled, Trudeau Exposed, a leader who embraces Islamic supremacists and Khalistani terrorists. So, before I go on, I don't normally like to read longer quotes, but I'm going to read you this one because this is a very important quote that came from a young blogger in India. And it shows the insights of this young fellow. And what it did for me was bring to mind how visible minorities are constantly spoken for and insulted as if they can't see what's going on and who is a friend and who is an enemy. And also there are those in the groups who will exploit a situation. So it's a real mixed bag. Everybody, of course, that's outside of America is not your enemy or your friend. America and Canada have been immigrant countries for some time, but there have been changes after 9/11, given the global war on jihad terror. And this needs to be remembered. So I'm going to read for you what this young blogger from India said about Justin Trudeau back in 2018. By the way, he wasn't welcomed. It took him days, I think around 6 days before Modi finally came out and welcomed him. Him and his family were just touring around India and they were not greeted by the leader of India, which was very embarrassing, not just for the leader of Canada, it was embarrassing for all of Canada, because here we are saying, my goodness, this is how our leader is presented, our leader in Canada on the world stage. It was very embarrassing. So back to what this kid said, what he wrote. Justin Trudeau is a mascot, I'm quoting directly here, is a mascot of everything that is wrong with the world today. From being at the forefront of encouraging every degeneracy to welcoming radicalism into his homeland, from cheap gimmicks of tokenism to attempts at creating a culture of politically correct absurdities, the stink of his leftist hypocrisy waves far and wide. As a citizen of India, he goes on to say, I could not care less if the elected leader of Canada seeks to drive his nation to the dumps. But where it has an adverse effect on my country is where I choose to draw the line. India is not CNN studio, where global champions of pseudo-liberalism, pseudo-secularism, and radical Islamism will find a platform to propagate their hypocrisy and watch the world burn. You might be the offspring of royalty, he says, and the global poster boy of liberal values, but it amounts to zilch, especially if you mess with India, unquote. I think that young lad speaks for everybody who cares about security, who cares about true human rights, who cares about pluralism, who actually cares about diversity, meaning diversity of opinion and responsible diversity. I think that holds true for everybody that holds to values, democratic rights and freedom and values. Recall the race discrimination card against Trump was pulled out so swiftly, and it constantly gets pulled out. But this guy in Canada is the one that's seen as diverse. Quite the contrary. He's the blackface one that has shown himself up to be a hypocrite again and again and again. He's all but abandoned Homeland Security in Canada. And frankly, as we see now with the Native protest and his lack of response to both Natives and the country, once again, we see where his priorities lie. Recall, and I've said this before, that he was quoted in the Christian Post as saying, quote, Christians are the worst part of Canadian society. This is something that is really scary when you look at those values, when unfortunately Trump is made out to be the scary one. It's this kind of a thinking that's really scary in our world today. I'm going to go on now to our other subject matter, and that is J Street president embraces Mahmoud Abbas after his UN Security Council appearance in mid-February. So the J Street president is Jeremy Ben-Ami, And he welcomed and actually embraced Mahmoud Abbas after Abbas had made statements at a hotel weeks before, some weeks ago, following remarks at a UN Security Council session where Abbas denounced the deal of the century. Of course, I mean, we know some of that, and we know some of the protests and so on, but this is what the speech was about, and there was J Street embracing Abbas. Now, I'd like to note some of the comments that Abbas has made. More recently, in fact, I can't even say more recently, it just depends on what his agenda happens to be at the time, but we both know he's a leader of the Palestinian, we all know that he's a leader of the Palestinian Authority, and the Palestinian Authority actually represents what's documented, the obliteration of Israel. So that's the Palestinian Authority, it's the Hamas goal, it's the Fatah goal, it is just the goal across the board when you look at that region. So this is what Abbas has said about Israel and about Jews. Quote, in a final resolution, we would not see the presence of a single Israeli, civilian or soldier on our lands. He was referring to a future Palestinian state. Abbas also did his PhD in Holocaust denial. And in a recent blood libel statement, Abbas declared, certain rabbis in Israel have said very clearly to their government that our water should be poisoned in order to have Palestinians killed. Utter nonsense. But this is what he's been out declaring in one of these usual blood libels. He also stated that the Alaska Mosque is, quote, ours, and they have no right, he's saying, quote, again, this is a quote, to defile it with their filthy feet. We will not allow them to, and we will do everything in our power to protect Jerusalem, unquote. Call ourselves what you want, but I will not accept it, he goes on to say. The Jewish state, I will not accept it, unquote. Another quote, we find that Zionists believe in the purity of the Jewish race, as Hitler believed in the purity of the Aryan race. Zionism calls to find a fundamental final solution to the Jewish question in Europe by immigration to Palestine. Hitler also called for this and implemented it. This I find so horrific to read when we all know what Hitler did to the Jews, and we also know what the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem worked with Hitler to do with the Jews. Jews are not the people who have been murdering people. Jews have been trying to defend their Jewish state since 1948. The day it was declared, pretty much, there was an onslaught against it by surrounding Arab states. That is the fact of what's going on with Israel. It has its roots, and it's the Jewish homeland in that region, which is backed up by archaeological finds. When one looks at the Palestinian claim to that land, Palestinians, yes, they've been called an invented people, but if you look at the real origins of the collective group of Palestinians, they're Ottoman South Syrians from the surrounding regions after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. He also said, Abbas, we welcome every drop of blood spilled in Jerusalem, unquote. He also stated that, quote, the root cause of the Holocaust was not so much the Nazis' genocidal hatred of Jews as the Jews' own conduct. So now he's blaming the Jews. Quote, he says, specifically their social behavior, adding that he meant their social function related to banks and interests, unquote. Very alarming. As recent as February 2nd, it was reported in the Financial Times that Mahmoud Abbas has cut relations with Israel and in the US in response to proposals by Donald Trump that paved the way for Israel to annex more occupied Palestinian land, unquote. Yet J Street is embracing and abetting this man? Why? Why are they doing so? Abbas has been rather clever in roping in J Street. He already has his Palestinian resistance interests secured in the House. We all know where Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar stand, and he knows it. He knows how to expand his jihadi interests further using J Street. Recall also that when Omar was being called out last year for her anti-Semitism, that Bernie Sanders came out and say, we will stand by our Muslim brothers and sisters, unquote. And it's not the first time either that what we see happening here with J Street, because last year, Abbas met with representatives of the group in Ramallah for a dialogue session. Abbas welcomed the delegation led by Ben-Ami and expressed his, quote, appreciation for their efforts to support the peace process within American society, unquote. J Street is helping Abbas to free Palestine from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, which means to obliterate Israel from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. And that is cause for concern. The Republican Jewish Coalition tweeted out in response to J Street's actions, absolutely disgusting that J Street and Jeremy Ben-Ami would embrace Mahmoud Abbas. Abbas funds terrorists to kill American and Israeli Jews. He is a virulent anti-Semite. Ben-Ami isn't a head of state. He doesn't have to pretend Abbas is legitimate, unquote, in that tweet. The tweet went on, the thread, and it concluded Abbas's government paid $330 million to terrorists and to families of martyrs who target Jews. They can even earn more based on if Jews die and how many die. That's who J Street and Jeremy Ben-Ami embrace so warmly, unquote. In Canada, J Street's counterpart is J Space. The problem here is that it is mind-boggling to think that this group could embrace a man like Abbas. And it's bad for everybody because we in the West as a whole face a global war against Jihad terror, and Abbas is a central figure in it. So on to the next story. The Greek army has been conducting live ammunition drills on the Turkish border as Muslim migrants swarm into Greece. Turkey's Islamic supremacist leader, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and we're not going to have time today, of course, to get into the details of what this man is, but he's known as an Islamic despot, and he is a jihadist to the core, and he believes in reestablishing the Ottoman Empire. He has made no secret about it, and he has often accused Europe of Islamophobia. In fact, he once stated about Europe that the European Union is in a process of dissolution because, you see, that is what his wish is, and that one or two countries cannot keep the EU alive. Of course, this is mockery against the EU. You need a country like Turkey, he says, a different country symbolizing a different faith. This would make them very strong. Yes, that's exactly what it sounds like. He wants to see Europe become an Islamic state, and this is what he claims will make Europe very strong. So his vision has long been the Islamization of Europe. What I find really puzzling is what, pray tell, is this man still doing in NATO? So he desires to see the revival of the Ottoman Empire. He looks at the EU as a laughing stock, and he has made no secret of it. And he has also warned, by the way, and he's done it more than once, of the coming war between the cross and the crescent, he calls it. Now, Erdogan announced last week, and I think most of you know this, that migrants will be free, a whole new wave. Last I heard, it was about 100,000, but more will be free to pass through his country into Greece and further on to Europe. So obviously this is the Hijra. And what happened here is that the European Union has actually not broken any promises, as he is saying. He has been constantly holding the European Union hostage, saying, you're not helping us deal with these migrants, so we're going to release all these migrants into Europe. He's lying, because the European Union, including the UK, have poured billions of dollars into the Turkish coffers in return to keep the migration at bay, but he didn't honor that. He went and released it completely, and it's obvious what he's doing. So now we're seeing that since he's opened the gates like he's threatened to do, the Greek people are not taking it sitting down. There are reports of the Greek citizenry fighting back, and also the Greek government starting to fight back. But here's what's also going on here. Okay, well, let me back up here a minute, because the Greek Prime Minister said something very interesting. He referred rightly to Turkey as an official migrant trafficker, unquote. And he accused Turkey, and this is an understatement, of exploiting Greece for its own political agenda, and that's very, very obvious. But what's really strange now is that the EU, who has been, let's not forget, not long ago, the EU was pressurizing member states to take their migrant quotas. In fact, the EU courts were bullying the Eastern Bloc, the Visegrad group, which consists of, let me see here, Hungary, Poland, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia. And they were not taking in the Muslim migrants as directed by the EU to do. and they tried to bully Poland into doing it. The height of it was when Beata Szydło, a former leader of Poland, was in charge, and she did not back down, and neither did Viktor Orban, and they stood up to the EU. And now the EU seems to be switching its position in the wake of coronavirus and in the wake of the brazenness of what we see going on with Erdogan. So the EU issued a statement and stated that EU member states strongly reject what it sees as Turkey's use of migrants for political goals. That statement applied to all of the member states, some 27. Turkey also now, this is what he's doing in retaliation to Greece's retaliation, he has now deployed 1,000 police at the Greek border to stem pushback of the Muslim migrants, and he's actually now reportedly arming the migrants with tear gas, and some of them are becoming increasingly violent, and they're lighting tire fires and using tree trunks as battering rams to get through those fences. So while some of them are shouting Allahu Akbar. So this is heating up, and we don't know what's coming next. It is nice to hear that the EU surprisingly is on the side of Greece, but we're going to see the way this is heating up, because it's quite scary right now, given the virtually the open declaration of war by Erdogan, because that's what it is. So the next on our item here is the city of Paterson, New Jersey has a new ordinance. Council members decided to allow the broadcast of the Adhan, or the Muslim call to prayer, over loudspeakers during a 16-hour span. The ordinance states, the city shall permit Adhan call to prayer, church bells, and other reasonable means, of announcing religious meetings to be amplified between the hours of 6 o'clock in the morning and 10 p.m. for duration not to exceed 5 minutes straight. But the comparison to church bells has been made before and is absolutely bizarre. Church bells are just church bells that play, and that's it. There's no declaration in church bells, and even if there was, we have a constitution based on free democracies, Judeo-Christian democracies. Some like to deny it, but it is. And if you look at, if you don't want to agree that it's based on scripture, let's just look at the tenets of scripture, that all men and women are created equally in the image of God. Okay, that is where equal rights stem from, and it comes from. I had the privilege to interview a medical doctor that worked against the caste system in India once, and she explained to me, she said, do you know why persecution still happens with certain groups in India? It's because Christianity is seen to be a threat, because the message of all people being created equal as opposed to our caste system poses a problem among these groups. And that was a lot of years ago. India has come a long way since then. And yes, I know that Modi gets blamed for nationalism sometimes, but not taking our eyes off what our mission is here, and that is to raise awareness as to the threats to America and to the Western world at large. It's very different in the sense what you see happening within the confined space of India versus what's going on where Islam dictates that the world is divided into the House of War versus the House of Islam, and the command is to subjugate the House of War, the disbelieving nations, under the House of Islam. And that is very, very critical. So going back to those church bells, to compare church bells is absolutely bizarre. The Adhan, by the way, is not just a sound or a bell. If it was just a sound, you might say, well, okay, this is just a sound. We may not agree with it considering the problems that we face today, but come on, it's just a sound. It is a loud shouting and a declaration of Islamic supremacism over infidel nations that Paterson residents now will be subjected to daily. Here's what it says. Quote, God is the greatest, in brackets, Allahu Akbar, intoned 4 times. I testify that there is no God but Allah. This is being shouted in New Jersey here. I testify that Muhammad is God's prophet, and that's intoned twice. Come to prayer, intoned twice. Come to security, salvation, intoned twice. God is the greatest, intoned twice. There is no God but Allah, intoned twice. This is what, and the councilman, Shaheen Khalik, proposed that ordinance which ended up being an amendment to the existing noise control ordinance that's going on, that was in effect. So this is now the declaration of Islamic supremacy being shouted in loudspeakers every single day that residents have to endure. My next topic, the gun-free UK. Almost 10,000 gun crimes have happened this year with the help of open-door immigration. Now, despite this country, the UK, being known as basically gun-free, due to its strictest gun control laws in the world, Britain has seen gun crime rise by 27% in 5 years, and the number of firearms seized has quadrupled. It's being blamed on suicidal immigration policy, thanks to the likes of, it goes way back, David Cameron, total failure on immigration policy, and Theresa May, another failure from her days as Home Secretary, during which we saw Middle Eastern and African gangs and jihadists proliferating across Britain, as well as Islamic hate preachers that remain a problem. Meanwhile, she bans Robert Spencer from coming in, and others have been banned as well. So here's what was reported in Jihad Watch about this as well, that a Middle Eastern gun runner told a news outlet that it's very easy to bring guns into Britain and that he could sell weapons 4 times as much as he purchases them for in Europe. What the smuggler does is that he travels to France, he picks up the guns, okay, and after he picks up the guns from the migrant camps in Calais, he brings them back to the UK. So there's a trade going on with these migrant camps. And the Calais jungle, as it is known, has been dismantled several times. It was once known as a war zone, and there's still reports of problems in these areas, and that it's still kind of like a war zone. And some years ago, these armed migrants were setting up 30 roadblocks every single night to attack British-bound vehicles that were traveling through Calais, and they were bringing huge stashes of weapons that were eventually discovered in some of the vehicles. And the truck drivers on duty were so scared that they were doing everything they can to try to keep themselves from being attacked. They'd resort to, they were scared because of rocks coming through their windows. Some actually threw back, some placed bits of pork on their trucks to try to keep off the migrants in their bumper and hoping that they won't climb on. It was an absolute disaster that was going on then. So eventually it was dismantled, this jungle as they called it, but still there are problems going on in these no-go zones, many across Europe being reported as warlike zones. We see it in particularly in Sweden, and we see it in France, and we also see it in other areas as well. Something to watch for, and that's my next story here. I have to keep my eye on the time here. No one should be upset about someone of any faith getting elected. That is, if that person has an America First agenda. And when I say America First, I don't mean a divisive agenda. I mean all Americans first. It's very interesting how the far left often say, oh, America First is a supremacist agenda. No, it's an agenda, if you want to put it that way, to protect all Americans, regardless of creed, regardless of race, okay? So in North Carolina, Nida Alam, you may or may not be watching, but it's a good idea to watch. That's all I'm saying. She was elected to office in North Carolina, and her campaign prioritized the significance of her Democratic primary win in Durham by stating that no previous Muslim American woman won elections to hold office in the state. Alam went on to celebrate and promote the hijab, the Islamic symbol of female oppression. And she deems it bigotry to oppose it. In fact, she used the hijab as a campaign logo. Here's what she said. My silhouette on my campaign logo was of my hijab because I wanted to be very unapologetic about that. Well, what about the women who are being abused for not wearing hijabs in Islamic states? She owes them an apology, I'd say. And she points out little girls were so excited and said, that's you? Is that you really in a hijab? Is that the hijab that you use? She goes on to say they were so excited to see that kind of representation. And it really solidified for me how important it was for me to be running for office, she said. But what about American interests? So this is what Nida Alam beams with pride over. And she wants Americans to accept it because that's her priority. But let's go now to what the Quran says about the hijab. In fact, not about just the hijab, it specifically refers to the entire veiling of a woman. So many people have heard that it is not in Islamic scripture, it is something cultural. No, it's not. It's in the Quran. Quran 24:31 states, and tell the believing woman to reduce of their vision, and guard their private parts and not expose their adornment except that which appears thereof, and to wrap a portion of their head covers over their chests, and not expose their adornment except to their husbands, their fathers, their husbands' fathers, their sons, their husbands' sons, their brothers' sons, their sisters' sons, their women, that which their right hand possesses, or those male attendants having no physical desire, or children who are not yet aware of the private aspects of women. And let them not stamp their feet to make known what they conceal of their adornment, and turn to Allah in repentance, all of you, O believers, that you might succeed. Did you catch that? Not even stamp your feet, because then people will hear what you have on. So not only are they completely not seeing, they're not to hear what you have on under that garment if you happen to be wearing jewelry. Now, if a woman just chooses not to cover, she's fair game to be assaulted. Here's what the Quran 33:59 says. O Prophet, tell your wives and your daughters and the women of the believers to bring down over themselves and their outer garments. That is more suitable, that they will be known and not be abused, unquote. So this is what Islam is pushing as a garment. Well, the hijab, coverings for women, Muslim rights for women, when she's not really considering what Muslim rights actually mean for women according to Sharia law, where women are deemed to be inferiors. This is her agenda for America. She was a signatory, by the way, to a Muslim Affairs Council's petition entitled, "We Stand with Representative Ilhan Omar," and subtitled, "Community Leaders from all over the US are supporting Representative Ilhan Omar against bigotry," unquote. Alam wants to see also better education in schools, since in her view, opposing the hijab is rooted in hatred and bigotry. Not equality for women, but she is accusing Americans of hatred and bigotry who oppose the hijab. CARE, by the way, which has been influential, very influential in North Carolina, unsurprisingly supported her candidacy. We also wrote on Jihad Watch about some of the activities that CARE is undertaking in North Carolina, in fact, all over America. So the alliance between Neda Alam, CARE, the Muslim Public Affairs Council, and her unwavering support for Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib should be matters of concern, not to mention her forcing this issue of the hijab, and she wants to do so into the school system. Otherwise, she's calling it bigotry. Another topic here that we're going to include, and I'm going to go through this quick. More Asian grooming gang members are sentenced for raping children in Huddersfield, England. Okay, the Breitbart article said Asian grooming gangs. I can't tell you, and this is a pet peeve of mine, no article should ever refer to Muslim rape gangs as being Asian grooming gangs to be covering up their identity. A lot of Brits right now in political power have been suffering a lot of issues because they're bringing it out and they want to call for luck. Let's be honest with this. Let's be open with this. These are Pakistani men, the vast majority that are raping young girls. How about we consider their lives? But no, they're doing everything to cover the issue up, even calling them Asian grooming gangs. Now, when people say Asian, everybody knows you're generally referring to the Chinese population. Yes, we know about South Asia, okay? But these are Pakistani Muslim men who have been raping infidel girls and calling them the worst racial names in the books to boot. So this horror is never ending, and the longer it goes on for, I'm afraid, the more it's becoming accepted, because there's a concept in psychology called habituation. When you hear something again and again and again, or you see something again and again and again, you become habituated, meaning it's a habit. It no longer affects you. People are so accustomed now to hearing about these Asian grooming gangs, Muslim rape gangs, that it seems like it's become accepted as a normal part of the society. There's absolutely nothing normal about it, and lives are being ruined. So I'm going to move on here. Very briefly, other items to watch out for in brief, because there's no time to really get into all of these, but just something to look out for. In Sweden, a Muslim teacher declared that those who oppose the Islamic headscarf should leave the country. Get a load of that brazenness. In Iran, Khomeini says that coronavirus outbreak is not such a big tragedy and can be overcome through jihad, meaning prayer in that context, and he even called it health jihad, while some people, faithfuls, have been licking shrines in Iran because they're on a health suicide mission. They're trying to lick off the coronavirus so fellow worshippers won't have to face it. So this is what's going on there. And what this shows is the mindset of how zealous some of these people are. And for people who believe in open immigration, imagine bringing that kind of a mindset into the country along with everything else that we've been trying to teach people again and again and again. When one looks at these types of doctrines, they're not that type of Sharia doctrines and what is being protected in these countries, it is certainly not compatible with democracies. And to even declare that is to be called Islamophobic. Okay, so now I'm going to come back off my rant, from my rant. In a landmark speech in the eastern city of Mulhouse, France, Macron said, "We must never accept that the laws of religion can be superior to those of the Republic. Islamist separatism is incompatible with freedom and equality." We're talking about people who, in the name of religion, are pursuing a political project. So he goes on and on and on to warn people about this kind of ideology. What happened to Macron? Is that the same Macron we're talking about here? Yes, it is. And the reason why is because so-called populist groups have risen and they're starting to appeal to the public who's asking questions. So all of a sudden he wants to pretend like he cares about the French public. But when there were no voices that were that influential, we saw something quite different, didn't we? But that is the voice of the latest version of Macron. We've seen Angela Merkel do U-turns the same way when it's feasible for her, depending on election time. So the Islamic State, this is another one, media operative, and an Islamic State media operative, she advises Muslims in the West, and this is very important, to be patient and strike the enemy with a deadly blow. Her message to me resembled that of 9/11, who's known as the mastermind, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. He once advised, and I've got this written down here, "We will win because Americans don't realize we do not need to defeat you militarily. We only need to fight you long enough for you to defeat yourself by quitting." Large-scale attacks like 9/11 were nice, he says, but not necessary. Jihadi-minded brothers would immigrate to the United States, and this goes for the world, wrap themselves in America's rights and laws, lawfare, until they were strong enough to rise up and attack us. He went on to say that brothers must relentlessly continue. So he believes also and has spread that message about being patient. Last but not least, 174 Democrats, including the squad, voted against a ban on hiring jihadi terrorists and sexual predators for the TSA. What are these people trying to do? TSA. They voted against the ban on hiring these types of folks. And that is it for our message today, for our briefing. I could go on and on, but I think I won't, because my time has now come to a close. And we're going to ask Mary to come back on, and Dick. There you go, Mary.
All I can do is go like this.
Well, I could speed up my pace a bit. I'll get more stories in.
No, I walked through a couple of those, and I thought, when you were talking about Turkey and how the migrants were working their way trying to get across to Greece, I heard that, and I don't know if this is true, but I heard that the police that are on the border in Greece are trying to stop the migrants fighting their way across by stripping them naked and leaving them in their underwear to go back. I don't know if that's true.
Now, I didn't hear that one, but I assure you, Mary, tonight I will be looking that one up.
Mary, did you dream that? Where was that, Mary?
No, that may have been my nightmare. I don't know.
Mary, come on.
Oh, but the other thing, the serious part of all of this is that when you were talking about the tire fires, all I could think about was Hamas.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
mean, Hamas has been doing
right
this
on
for a very long time. So are they now kind of influencing and infiltrating and doing some training on how to fight the borders? And
That's a
way
very
across?
interesting, that's very interesting what you noted, Mary. And it's true. I mean, when you look at, first of all, and this is something that Phil Haney brought to the surface, and I want to express how regretful and upset I was to hear about that news. Such a great man, very, very upsetting. We wrote a couple pieces we had displayed on Jihad Watch, just commemorating him, his life, his message. But one thing that really impressed me about what he said, and this needs to be remembered if nothing else, on what I said today, this is so important. And yes, there's a lot that's been said, but one thing Phil Haney established, and a lot of people don't realize, is the partnership between Al-Qaeda and the Muslim Brotherhood. A lot of people don't realize that, because the Muslim Brotherhood was largely what they tried to call, or people recognize as, some kind of a reform movement, meaning they do ascribe to normative Islam and Wahhabism, but they do it in a more Western, civilized looking way. And we know that from the Muslim Brotherhood operatives. We know about the document about conquering North America, the Muslim Brotherhood memorandum. We know about that. That's out there. It's available for any research, for anybody to see. It was a living document. But there's something else that Phil brought up, is how close Al-Qaeda and the Muslim Brotherhood really are. Something to remember, and a lot of people don't realize this, if you were to research the Muslim Brotherhood operatives and what their original call is, their original call is to bloody jihad. And people forget it because we live in the West. But if you look at Hamas, they're into bloody jihad. They're even training children in the Palestinian territories toward bloody jihad, and they're Muslim Brotherhood. We also need to recognize as well that when you look at the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, which is also advanced, they're very violent in Egypt. So that is actually the call of the Muslim Brotherhood. The thing is, once they become more and more emboldened, they become increasingly aggressive until they become violent. So that question that you bring up there, Mary, about Hamas, Hamas is Muslim Brotherhood as well. And Muslim Brotherhood operatives are everywhere, and they are one and the same as Al-Qaeda and all of these people. And they try to distance themselves by saying, oh, we don't condone violence. Yes, they do.
Yeah.
It's written even in their documents. For example, there was this document that was discovered in the Al-Qaeda Maghreb, simply called The Project, a Muslim Brotherhood document, and it was almost identical to the memorandum for North America. What made this even more disturbing is that it was so intricate, and it went into specifically discussing the various cultures in Africa and the cultures that you encounter, and how it's necessary to be like a chameleon to infiltrate those cultures at every single level to expand. And this was discovered in the Al-Qaeda Maghreb. So when we start seeing these kinds of means and methods of operation, they call it, these kinds of MO that resembles Hamas, we realize, of course, there's a unity among them. There's an end goal. Some of them function a certain way, some more violent, some choose not to be as violent, but there's that ultimate goal of conquest. And the Muslim Brotherhood documents of the role of the Muslim Brotherhood is jihad by the sword. We also see it actually at the border of Mexico, where more and more reports have surfaced to talk about narco-terrorism, and how we have seen that there are operatives there that belong to Hezbollah and, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood.
Right.
And what's the tactics we also see there? Human shields. Push the women out front, push the children out front. So we do start to see some of these repetitions that we see going on in the Middle East. It's no surprise. We'll see them more and more and more proliferate globally, because it's all part of the same cause of expansion, of conquest, even though people's methods may differ.
Right.
Well, I think what you both just engaged in is important. And I think anytime we can refer to Philip Haney, we want to. So Philip Haney always looks for indicators. You just connected some dots, Mary, the methods of Hamas. And also the other thing, if we want to just spend a little bit more with Philip, what did Philip do? Philip has been published in the Indian defense magazines for 4 articles in the last year. We know that. So Philip has been identifying the Muslim Brotherhood. He's been talking about the Muslim Brotherhood on our air, working with Iran. But he also talked about the Deobandis, the Al-Qaeda of the Indian subcontinent. So one of the reasons Trump is embraced is because the Indians understand Pakistan. They understand their Islamic doctrine. They have had 500 people killed in one day in Mumbai a few years ago. So the Indians very much understand and appreciate the president's addressing of the dangers of Islam mentality, the killing of people, and it's very, very close to them. So their embracement reminded me of Philip Haney. Philip Haney,
Yes.
his work with Jim Phelps is being embraced by the Indian
Wow.
government. And in
Amazing.
America, Philip couldn't get his hand, he couldn't get anybody to answer the door when he knocked about participating again here. So if anybody's interested, you can go to the Indian Defense, look up, Google Philip Haney, Jim Phelps, Indian Defense Agency, and you'll see 4 articles. One was published after his, one of the articles was published on the day Philip's body was found. So this is very, very close to home. God bless Philip Haney, and we
Yes.
miss his ability to connect dots.
Yes. We
so
sure do.
I just want to say, this is a fantastic mosaic. Your work, not just to write about these things, Christine, but to prepare this evening for us,
Oh, yes.
it's a gift. It's a gift to all of us in North America. You're actually connecting dots by collecting a set of stories. If anybody is interested, 5 or 6 of those stories are right off Jihad Watch in your articles in the last week. So anybody that wants to know about the French gentleman who's had a change of mind, you can read about that. You can read about Iran, and you can see a video of the Iranians licking the gates. All right. I want to mention a couple things you've connected here. You mentioned Abbas. You know what? Abbas has a connection to the French premier, the French president, Macron.
Macron. Yep. Emmanuel Macron.
All right. He went to celebrate the historical 75th anniversary of the Holocaust in Jerusalem. The day after he did that, he went over to the Palestinian territories and sat with Abbas, that's his name, Abbas. So this gentleman is a classic politician, not unlike Mr. Trudeau.
Yes.
And he will work as if there are no absolutes, as if he has no principles. So again, I think you're pointing out that is critical, and I think that's the other thing I think you pointed out about the Asian grooming gangs is critically important. These are Pakistanis. We have had situations in America, all right, it's Philip Haney again. The Obandis, Pakistanis, very, very dangerous people. Philip did the work on the Obandis. Philip connected the dots. San Bernardino, the Obandi, Orlando, the Obandi, ongoing threats in America to the Obandi mosques. Without Philip doing that, he was doing it, but he was ineffective in the last few years because they put him in a room, so he couldn't continue his work. So we are at a loss without Philip on all of these items. By your connecting the dots, you're certainly helping us fill that gap. I'm hoping that people are taking notes. To be honest, they're going to have a lot of notes, and that's a good thing. And they can do their homework, doing their own research and checking into Jihad Watch. So.
It's a privilege, Dick. And there's something I'd like to leave for food for thought. It's this constant guilt that's being put on the Western countries of, you've got these sins of the past where you oppress this person, that person, you oppress this one. The thing is, a lot of groups also oppressed groups in the past. It's not just white people that oppressed others. In fact, Islamic supremacist Arabs are still holding black slaves. Oppression still goes on long after so-called colonialists have repented and moved on. In fact, we're so welcoming that aside from getting rid of that portion of history, we're still, as nations, feeling so guilty about it. Bad people don't feel that guilty. The time has gone. We have embraced people to the point now where they're punching people in the face, including me, who's a visible minority. And so it's not just us versus them. There are a lot of minorities out there. Look at the Indian population and others, the Hispanics in the church. It's across the board. People are tired. There are a lot of people that are fed up with this nonsense, this political correctness. And it's not that they're racist or they've joined white supremacists. No, they support democracy and pluralism, which is the biggest safeguard against totalitarianism, which is what we're getting into with Islamic supremacism and, of course, Marxism. This is what we need to be warned about intensely.
And it's a combination of, well, the Marxists are identifying and finding a new victim group almost every day.
Every
They
day,
love to
yes.
find the victim group. So they can take native Canadians and deal with them as victims, allowing the chaos to stew in Canada. They can connect, your comment about Trump's support in India. And then you mentioned this church in Miami. Another coincidence is I was there.
You were there.
I was there. That's only
Okay.
because I hang out with my older brother. He's not my older brother, my big brother, Tom Trento. He's much bigger. But Tom Trento, we were there with thousands of people as the
Terrific.
Evangelicals for Trump were kicked off in that monster church. Tom interviewed Hispanic people. There's a Hispanic woman who we may continue to work with who is very, very articulate. So this whole notion, by the way, the other thing is, of course, a lot of the people in this group, the Hispanic evangelicals, also know all about communism. They know all about Cuba. They know all about Venezuela, and they are articulate in telling the story. So that's another significant. So really, the lines are being drawn. In my mind, 2020 is the year when people will incrementally recognize World War III. You have enemies fighting enemies. Trudeau is an enemy. The gentleman who runs India is on our side with Donald Trump. Bibi Netanyahu is on our side. The man who runs Hungary is on our side. You mentioned the
Yes.
three countries. We basically have people who believe in sovereignty. So it's almost like we are informally starting a new group called sovereign nations as opposed to United Nations. United Nations is largely a Soviet created Marxist as the EU is. So you have these sovereign leaders of sovereign nations who want to continue to be sovereign, popping up and getting to know each other and embracing each other. What a great video. There was, as we a little bit longer in that video, and that stadium must have had 120,000 people.
But
There
yet,
was a
Yes.
Trump rally in India.
It
but
was
yet the
amazing to see.
the news story that they put out, and if we'd continued the video, was slamming him for not getting the numbers that he thought he was going to get. And I'm looking at the numbers thinking, holy cow, how many more people could you stuff in that, auditorium?
You couldn't fit anyone else.
No,
I say.
exactly.
They would say anything about this guy.
That's the
It doesn't
downside.
even matter if it's a
Yeah.
blatant lie anymore. They
Right.
say anything to try to discredit Trump.
Unbelievable. Yep.
We've
And
got a
so we've got a couple questions.
All right, Mary, let's do a
get to
couple of
those?
questions, a couple of other things. I think, again, I just want to say, this is a marvelous contribution that you make when you're on with us. This is
Thank you so much, Dick.
Very
I know it
blessed.
takes time and energy to do it and then to project it in a way that we can understand. So thank you for that. What do we got, Mary?
Well, we've got Mitch from Michigan is asking you, he says, thank you, Christine, for all you do. Can you look into a
Mitch.
connection between Syed Mohammed Rizvi from British Columbia, Canada, and author of a booklet entitled Child Marriage, How To, and how this information ends up in a mosque in Dearborn in the House of Wisdom. And this is related to an article that just came out, but the book is actually titled Marriage and Morals in Islam. And the guy is Vancouver Islamic Educational Foundation, British Columbia, Canada. So it's interesting that within this document, apparently it's promoting child marriages, and it ends up in a mosque inside Dearborn, Michigan.
What this shows is actually the Muslim Brotherhood plan for North America. And this is something that we've discussed on our tests sometimes before shows, that Canada historically has been largely ignored by the States. I know, but it's becoming increasingly a threat when you look at that common border. But the thing is, the Muslim Brotherhood recognizes North America. It didn't just simply say the Muslim Brotherhood plan for America, it was North America. It is a huge territory. And if you look at the border between Canada and the United States, it's double the border of that of Mexico. So to me, it's no surprise it ended up. I mean, this is the day of globalization. A lot of travels take place. There's a lot of, you see a lot of alliances globally between the various groups. So that is unsurprising. What is really alarming is that these books are still circulating. They're circulating in mosques, and you guys do a lot of research on mosques, and I know that it came out years ago, and maybe you could verify this now. It came out years ago. I'm talking not long after 9/11, maybe a few years after 9/11, that some 80% of mosques were deemed to be radicalized. And that's no surprise given the funding coming from, at that point, they used to say Saudi Arabia, but it's been determined it's now coming from Iran and Turkey as well. Is it still that number around 80%, Mary and Dick?
I believe that is the number so far. I don't think it's changed, has it, Dick?
No, that was actually, a serious study,
Right.
a survey of mosques, and that was done, we could tell by people associated with Center for Security Policy, and David Yerslami is one of the authors of that, and he demonstrated that. The footnote to this question, by the way, I want to thank, this is an amazing audience that we have. We have wonderful people that have really been with us, and they've learned, and you can tell from the quality of questions.
They're so appreciated, yeah.
Yeah, so this is breaking news. About 4 hours ago, this article was published. I would advise everybody to go to that article. It's at leoholman.com. The article talks and documents, and the questioner is very insightful. Thank you to our questioner, Mitch. The article is about an undercover activity that was done in Dearborn, Michigan. And in the mosque, which is a Shia mosque, a notorious Shia mosque, where the imam, we know him well, is in direct support of the regime in Iran, speaks openly about why Iran is such an important place. So he is directly connected. He's a Shia imam. The book that was found in the mosque is written by the in British Columbia, the Vancouver Islamic Education Foundation. And in there is a guidance on marriage. And in that book, it talks not just about child marriages, but what are called temporary marriages. So this is a religious, quote, document, which is in the mosque, which is referred to by imams. It talks about the ability, you can of course have 4 wives. They can be underage girls, and they can also be temporary, which basically means you can, as a married man with multiple wives, including underage girls, you can have prostitutes. And so this is actually in the mosque. This is describing behavior which is criminal in Dearborn and every other city in the country.
And that teaching, by the way, is in the hadiths as well.
Yep.
The temporary wives,
Yep.
yes.
So the point here is, the sad thing in a way is, this is not something that I think if we were in Hungary or in Israel, it would be the police who would be in there looking around for any kind of dangerous potential for criminal behavior. In America, we do not have the police in Dearborn or North Carolina or South Carolina or any other city. They're not going into the mosques to find what's found. So a third party with some level of bravery, we know some of those people, go into mosques and find this material. And this is really the message to me is not just how terrible it is that people are encouraged to behave this way and commit crimes. It's the fact that we can't get anybody except people that are privately sponsored to go in to dangerously do this, so not police, to find this information. That's the disgrace.
It is absolutely disgraceful.
Between Hungary and Israel and the United States of America, and I'm going to say Canada as well. We are not getting, the police are not doing what it takes to protect. By the way, who are we protecting? I think we're protecting little Islamic girls. Why should America tolerate crimes against little girls just because they happen to be practicing Muslims? That's outrageous.
And women.
Yeah, right.
A lot of the women. I went for a blood test a couple of years back, just routine, and the lady there was talking to me about some of the women that come with complete coverings, and the man is the one answering all the questions for her. And when they roll up her arm for the blood test, and she says, this happens quite a bit. We could see burns up her arm, we could see bruises, and we can't say anything. The thing is, and I'm putting myself out there, if I had a church or I had any public place where I was preaching a message and I realized that people who were preaching a message, like let's say my faith, because I'm a Christian, they were preaching Christianity, and somebody said, you know what, Christine, there are people in this neighborhood that we heard is they're preaching bad messages, radical messages that we need to get to the bottom of it. I'm sorry, but I'd like to send somebody to sit in your congregation or in your building to monitor what you're saying, because this is for everybody's good, including yours. I would say, absolutely, it's for my good. It's for everybody's good. Welcome, come in, bring whoever you need, put up cameras, do whatever you want. I have nothing to hide. But this retaliation against monitoring mosques is for a reason. Dr. Sheikh Subi Mansour, who taught at Al-Azhar University and came out of that, and he was persecuted in Egypt for his views on reform. When he was exiled to America, he said he was shocked when he went into a mosque to pray, because he looked at the books and he said, oh my God, his words were, the soldiers of dictatorship have arrived in America. And that was a lot of years ago. We need to be surveilling those mosques.
So, for example, in the article, again, leoholman.com, please, it's really worth your time. Go to the article. There's a phone number to call. Here's the phone number. The person who went undercover is identified in the article. It's a great American. Advised people to call the phone number because he called the Channel 2 News, Fox News in Detroit, and reported that there are people promoting marriage and with children, basically pedophilia. It's right there, and the person on the line will not take the information. They will not review it. They basically call the person named. So the article invites people to call into Channel 2 and identify your concern. If you read this article, I guess the point here is that this is the same news station that has published repeatedly taken the wrong position. Some of you may remember the church in Bloomfield, Michigan, where Sharam Hadian, who was our guest tomorrow night, by the way, was not allowed to speak. That is related to the same mosque and the same Channel 2 news person who basically perverted the whole story. So I just wanted to make this point. This call, Patterson with the prayer, they do that in Hamtramck. When you read what they say 25 times a day over the loudspeaker, when you read those words, people need to pay attention to what they're saying. 5 times a day, they are promoting in words directly related to potential crimes against other people in America. If Jews are secondary and the prayer comes out to that, I mean, that's just totally unacceptable. These prayers, by the way, in Hamtramck, when those prayers are going, you can walk down any single street and you will see a woman covered head to toe in black with her eyes. That's all part of the package. The new lady in North Carolina, that's the beginning. Then the commission turns. Then they get the prayers going. Then they send somebody to Congress. That's really a process, and it works beautifully because of the Marxists in the country that want to promote that. So that's.
And Hamtramck, traditionally, historically,
Right.
was developed as a Polish town, and a lot of Polish Christians were there, and now have left.
Oh,
Wow.
big time.
Big time. Yep. And that's it for the questions. Just a lot of thanks for all that you do and all of the information you bring. And people are up in arms against the mosque deal now. So it's an incredible article. Absolutely. Please go out and read it. And
we have to, yes.
And get it to your, and the other thing that was brought out in that is it basically talks about how the mosque, the House of Wisdom, I think that's a House of Wisdom, was actually handing out and promoting Bernie Sanders as a candidate, as a 501c3. If the local media won't touch it, the law enforcement won't touch it, the IRS probably won't touch it. What do we do next? All we can do is keep knocking on doors, keep making phone calls. But I mean, we can't stop, but they are winning this war so badly. And so many people are fighting so hard to keep the traditions and the Constitution that we have. But when we try to get the people that need to respond, they don't. It's
So
tough.
this is actually interesting, Christine. You gave us news of the day, news of the week, and this last conversation in news of the hour. This is basically new things. So this is why from now on, we're going to continue to emphasize news and news analysis, your skill set from years of working with news analysis. And why don't you remind us again where people can find you on Jihad Watch?
Just go to jihadwatch.org and you'll be able, what I love about Jihad Watch is it gives you all of, it's bullet form. I mean, there are articles written, yes, but you can go to that site, get a run through and a bird's eye view of everything happening. Major news sources are included, as well as ones that may not be as popular, but they're all verified stories. And it's very important because a lot of these stories that even come out of the larger media, they're kind of put on the back pages, so to speak, and people don't pay attention. While with Jihad Watch, they're put forward right to the front there. So it's a great site to visit to find out day to day what is going on. And of course, when I pull some of these things together, I'm looking at news in Canada as well.
Well, I want to say that this is why we're so fortunate to have you. You also work on Front Page Mag. Front Page Mag, the David Horowitz group, those are in-depth articles. And there's an article coming out in parts now that we're actually working on our radio program. We're working through the parts of the story by Hendry, Hendry, and it's a series of articles. We did the first one. It was called Democrats, Progressives, and Socialists, I believe. It's an ongoing, in-depth study of the whole movement towards Marxism in America. So again, you're right in the middle.
Front Page Magazine. Oh yeah, I'm a big fan of that too. That's where I started my writing in print, actually, because I was a broadcaster for a lot of years. I started with Front Page Magazine, and believe it or not, I went on to news analysis for Metro News, co-owned by the Toronto Star. That's how I ended up in news analysis.
Excellent.
But then I had the show as well. So this has been a long time in the making. Front Page Magazine, Jihad Watch, you're going to get the goods. What's going on out there?
Great.
Big fan of both myself. I
So
can't say I'm not biased.
For you to capsulize this for us in this blitz hour is fantastic. And I would encourage people, this is what we need. We need to hear these stories. We need to do our homework. And you're my teacher here. We're learning, and we're very grateful for that.
And we're all on the same team, and I'm grateful for that.
Amen.
Thank
Dick,
you so much.
we have one question that I thought I'd let you go ahead and answer. It's they've got somebody that wants to join us and hear our programs and tune in. Do you want to tell them all about how and where?
Okay, Mary. So if you go to United West, thank you, Mary. I think that's a great cue. The UnitedWest.org, you go to the Sharia Crime Stoppers page, you click right on that item, Sharia Crime Stoppers. When the page opens up, at the top of the page, it says, if you want to join the webinar programs, register here. You click that link, you put your name down one time, and then you're registered for all the webinars we do. You'll get messages to tell us about the Monday programs, the Tuesday programs, and the every once in a while Thursday programs, just by registering that one time. Did I leave anything out, Mary?
No, you did very well. You did very well.
All right. Listen, this is great. We really love doing this. So you'll be with us in 2 weeks.
2 weeks.
And we really appreciate that. For those of you that are part of our Tuesday evening, tomorrow night, we're going to have Sharam Hadian, from Iran, ex-Muslim Christian pastor, giving us his insights in terms of what's going on as well. So again, things are happening so quickly. We want to keep on the news and the analysis. And tonight was a great example. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Dick and Mary, and thank you everybody for watching and joining us.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.